Okay, imagine a seemingly solid, unremarkable rock layer deep underground. For geologists, it might look tight, meaning fluids like oil or water won't easily flow through it.
Hmm.
But what is hidden within that rock were secret pathways, tunnels dug millions of years ago by tiny, squirming creatures, completely changing its potential value.
Yeah, it's more than just a thought experiment. It's a reality that subsurface scientists are definitely grappling with. These ancient biological traces, the structures organisms left behind, they can fundamentally alter the physical properties of rocks,
Right.
potentially creating valuable fluid reservoirs in places you might not expect at all.
And that's precisely what we're doing a deep dive into today. We've got a stack of sources here, research papers, detailed studies, all focused on this fascinating intersection of ancient life and rock properties.
Yeah.
Specifically looking at some groundbreaking work done on the Hanifa Formation in central Saudi Arabia.
That's right. Our mission today is really to unpack the key findings from this research, understand the surprising ways these ancient burrows influence rock quality and, crucially, fluid flow.
And maybe look at the challenges scientists face when trying to characterize them deep beneath the surface, right?
Exactly. There are definitely challenges.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly are we talking about when we say trace fossils in this context?
Okay, so unlike body fossils, which are the preserved remains of the organism itself, trace fossils are the geological evidence of their activity.
Ah, okay.
Think trails, footprints, or in the case we're focusing on, these structures created by burrowing. They tell us about how an organism behaved, how it interacted with its environment millions of years ago.
Got it. And the specific environment our sources highlight is the Upper Jurassic Hanifa Formation in central Saudi Arabia. Where and when was this formation laid down?
Right, the studies pinpoint its origin to what's called an eperic shallow marine setting. You can sort of imagine a vast, relatively shallow sea covering a continental shelf. This was situated on the southern margin of the ancient Tethys Ocean during the Jurassic period, roughly 10 degrees south of the equator back then. Conditions there were apparently perfect for accumulating carbonate sediments.
Carbonates can be quite varied, though. The sources mention layers made of mudstones, wackastones, grainstones, and also zones with bigger features like stromatoporoids and corals within this formation.
That variety is key, definitely.
Yeah.
But the real focus of these particular studies, the trace fossil that seems to have the most significant impact on the properties we care about, is the elastominoids.
Elastominoids. Okay, what does that structure actually look like?
It forms a very distinctive, interconnected network. It's often described as sort of a boxwork pattern, characterized by horizontal tunnels connected by vertical shafts.
Right.
And the sources provide pretty specific mentions, actually. These shafts have circular to elliptical cross-sections, long axis typically between, say, 0.4 and 1.6 centimeters, short axis maybe 0.2 to 1.5 centimeters, and the branches often join at quite predictable angles, 60, 90, or 120 degrees. It suggests a fairly organized burrowing behavior, not just random digging.
So it's structured, and the sources quantify this using bioturbation intensity or burrow percentage BP. Is that basically just how much of the rock volume these burrows take up?
Exactly. It's a really crucial metric. It's the percentage of the rock volume that has been physically disturbed or, replaced by these burrow structures. Whether it's 5%, 15%, or 30% BP, that number turns out to be highly significant for the rock's properties.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. The sources describe these burrowed zones as having a profound dual nature. It's like having two fundamentally different rock types coexisting within the same layer.
That's the core observation, yes. You have the original host matrix, the sediment that accumulated before the burrowing happened.
Right.
In the Hanifa examples, this matrix is typically mud-dominated and inherently tight. The visual porosity estimated in the studies is very low, usually 0% to 2%, averaging maybe 1.5%.
Very low.
And critically, the permeability, how easily fluids can flow, is also extremely low, often ranging from just 0.1 to 5 millidarcy, or MD.
Which is tiny in reservoir terms.
Oh, absolutely. A good producing reservoir might be hundreds or thousands of MD. So 0.6 millid on average is quite impermeable. This matrix might contain scattered skeletal bits or tiny pores, but it's not a good conduit for fluids on its own.
But the material filling the burrows is a completely different story.
A completely different story, yeah.
Yeah.
The material passively filling these thalassinoids burrows is described as grain-dominated and noticeably coarser. Most grains are larger than half a millimeter.
Okay.
It has what's called a packed stone texture, containing things like skeletal fragments, coated grains, pelloids, stuff like that. And the difference in porosity is clear. Visually estimated porosity is much higher, maybe 5%, 10%, averaging 7%.
And the permeability contrast is just massive, right, compared to that matrix.
It's dramatic. While the matrix is down in the single digits or less in MD, the permeability reported for the burrow fills ranges from 6 all the way up to 628 millid, with an average of 82 millid. So yeah, potentially 100 times more permeable or even more than the surrounding rock.
That's a huge difference packed into these tiny tunnels. The sources also note a distinct chemical difference in the fill.
They do. The burrow fills are often enriched in elements like iron and silicon compared to the calcium-rich carbonate matrix. That's why they often stand out visually with reddish or brownish colors.
And one of the sources puts forward a pretty surprising hypothesis about where this fill material actually came from.
This is a fascinating twist, yeah.
Hmm?
The detailed physical and chemical properties of the fill things like the specific minerals present, quartz, kaolinite, hematite, goethite, and the geochemistry, including factors like low calcium to magnesium ratios, high iron and silicon, and high chemical index of alteration CIA values, often above 80. These all show really striking similarities to Terra Rossa soils.
Terra Rossa, like the red soils you find on limestone.
Exactly. Terra Rossa soils are typically red clays that form on limestones under warm, humid conditions, often as the insoluble residues left after the carbonate dissolves.
So the implication is, this fill isn't just sediment stirred up from the local Jurassic seafloor.
That's the suggestion.
Huh.
The similarity to Terra Rossa soils implies this material might be external soil sediment that was somehow introduced into these open burrow systems after the primary marine deposition occurred, maybe much later.
That's pretty wild.
It is surprising. It means the high permeability pathways are potentially created by material that wasn't originally part of that Jurassic seabed environment at all.
Okay, this dual nature with a tight matrix and highly permeable, distinct fills is clearly important. Why does this matter so much for subsurface fluid flow for oil, gas, or water?
Well, it matters because where you have high permeability, you have potential pathways for fluids to move. The low permeability matrix essentially acts as a barrier, right?
Right, a wall.
But these high permeability burrow fills are like potential superhighways within that barrier.
So the high perm fill acts as the plumbing system. But just having scattered pipes isn't enough, is it? They need to be connected somehow.
That's the critical point the studies really highlight. It's not just the volume of burrows, the BP, it's whether that network becomes interconnected.
Okay.
The research in the Aquifer Formation indicates there's a threshold. The thalassinoids network needs to reach a certain density to become fully connected, allowing fluids to actually flow widely through the burrow system.
And based on these studies, what's that key threshold for connectivity? What BP are we talking about?
They found that the network becomes fully connected when the burrow percentage, the BP, reaches approximately 15%.
15%, okay.
Yeah, samples from the Aquifer Formation with BP consistently above this 15% threshold showed strong evidence of full connectivity. And this led to significantly higher overall bulk permeability for that rock volume compared to samples with lower BP, say less than 10%, where burrows were more isolated and unconnected.
So hitting that 15% BP mark is kind of like flipping a switch for fluid flow through the rock.
It seems to fundamentally change the nature of flow. Below that threshold, you might have some isolated high-perm pockets, but they don't really talk to each other.
Yeah.
Above it, you potentially have a continuous pathway cutting right through the tight matrix.
Okay, so we understand what these features are and why they matter, but how do geologists actually detect and evaluate these hidden networks deep underground? The sources mention various methods.
They do. They used a whole suite of techniques in the lab. Conventional measurement of porosity and permeability on little core plugs, CT scanning, which is great for visualizing the 3D structure of the burrows inside the core.
Like a medical CT scan?
Exactly like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Also petrographic analysis using microscopes to really study the matrix and fill textures in detail, and rock physics modeling.
Rock physics?
Yeah.
That's linking the physical properties to what we can measure with seismic waves,
Yeah,
right?
precisely. Try to bridge that gap.
Let's focus on that one, rock physics and seismic velocity. Seismic waves travel at different speeds depending on the rock they pass through. Geologists try to use this velocity to infer things about the rock, like its porosity or how stiff it is.
Right. And initially, when these researchers simply plotted velocity against porosity for their Aquifer samples, the relationship was, well, weak. There was a lot of scatter.
Okay.
The correlation coefficient, the R-squared value, for compressional wave velocity, VP, was very low, something like 0.11. Which basically means porosity alone wasn't a good predictor of velocity in these rocks.
Okay, let's unpack this. What happened when they brought the Burrow percentage, the BP, into the picture?
This is where the breakthrough happened. By including BP in their analysis, the relationship between velocity and porosity became dramatically clearer and highly predictable.
How much clearer?
The R-squared value for V jumped significantly, all the way up to 0.75.
Wow, that jump from 0.11 to 0.75 is massive. It means BP is suddenly explaining most of the variation in velocity. Why would more burrows make the rock faster for seismic waves? Isn't it just more holes?
It seems counterintuitive, but remember, the burrow fills are made of those coarser grains and have larger, better connected pores compared to the host matrix. This grain-supported fill material is mechanically stiffer than the weakly cemented, sometimes microporous, mud-dominated matrix.
Ah, okay. Stiffer means faster velocity.
Exactly. So as BP increases, a larger proportion of the rock volume is made up of this stiffer, faster material, leading to higher overall seismic velocity for any given total porosity.
And this increase in velocity also links back to that magic 15% threshold for connectivity.
It does, yeah. The studies found that the BP threshold of around 15%, where the burrows achieve connectivity and permeability, starts to significantly increase, getting above approximately 6 mD, corresponds to the same threshold where samples show notably higher compressional velocities, typically above 5,000 meters per second.
So hitting 15% BP creates a distinct signature that you might actually be able to see using seismic data, or at least infer.
That's the idea. It creates what they call a distinct petroacoustic signature. Rock physics techniques like evaluating equivalent pore aspect ratios, EPRs, which give you an idea of pore shape and thickness, can potentially identify these zones.
Right.
Higher BP samples in the study showed higher EPRs, above 0.22, which is consistent with having stiffer, grain-supported fill material dominating the rock's response.
But there's a crucial caveat here, isn't there? One that highlights how important the quality of the burrow fill is, not just the amount.
Absolutely critical point. This distinct petroacoustic signature, this link between high BP, high permeability, and high velocity, it only holds true if the burrow fills consist of that coarse-grained material with large, well-connected pores, like interparticle or moldic pores. If the burrows are just filled with mud-dominated sediment, maybe with only microporosity, similar to the host matrix itself, then increasing BP won't necessarily lead to this same velocity enhancement, even if there are lots and lots of burrows.
And the sources gave an example of this from the Hanifa Formation itself, comparing different locations.
Yes, exactly. They contrasted samples from one location, Jabal al-Abaqain, where the fills had those beneficial large pores and showed the expected burrow-enhanced properties, with samples from another location, the Makkah Road section, where the fills were muddy with mainly microporosity. At Makkah Road, even high BP didn't lead to the same velocity or permeability enhancements.
So it really underlines that you need the right kind of fill material, not just a high percentage of burrows.
Precisely. Understanding the fill is just as important as counting the burrows.
Now let's talk about a practical challenge mentioned in the sources. When we study subsurface rocks, we often rely on 2D views, right? A thin core slab, a well log response. But these burrow networks are fundamentally 3D things.
That's a significant hurdle in translating these lab findings to the real subsurface situation. It really is.
So what does this mean for accuracy? How well can a single 2D slice really represent the true 3D bioturbation intensity of a whole rock volume? Did they look into that?
They did. The researchers tackled this directly using computer models of different burrow types, including thalassinoids, scalithos, planolites. They could control the exact 3D BP in the model.
Okay.
And then slice it virtually in different orientations to see how accurately a 2D slice estimated that known 3D value.
And what did the model show about the potential error?
Well, they found that relying on 2D slices can introduce substantial errors in estimating the true 3D BP, particularly if you're trying to use a precise linear percentage scale, like saying it's 12% or 18%.
Right.
While using broader categories, like low, medium, high bioturbation, might keep your estimate in the right general ballpark most of the time, getting a quantitative percentage from 2D can be quite misleading. You could easily overestimate or underestimate.
Misleading by how much? Did they put numbers on it?
Yes, they did. They found that only about 15%, 15%, of the randomly oriented 2D slices they tested gave an estimate that perfectly matched the true 3D BP.
Only 15%, that's low.
It is low. Approximately half of the slices, 50%, were within one standard deviation of the true value, which corresponded to an error of about 4.5 percentage points in BP.
So if the true BP was, say, 15%, half the time your 2D slice would give you an estimate between roughly 10.5% and 19.5%.
Right. But critically, that means the other 50% had larger errors than that. And about 35% showed errors greater than that 4.5% standard deviation.
So more than a third of the time, a single 2D core photo or log interpretation could give you a pretty inaccurate picture of the actual burrow density in that rock volume. That's a significant challenge for subsurface evaluation.
It really highlights the limitation of 2D data when you're trying to characterize a complex 3D network. The error magnitude also seems to depend on the actual BP value and, importantly, the orientation of the slice relative to the burrow geometry.
So how you cut it matters.
Definitely. Though one source suggested the error wasn't strongly dependent on the specific burrow morphology itself, the orientation clearly does matter. Another source indicated vertical slices might be better for thalassinoids, for instance, but the general point is a single 2D view is often insufficient for precise BP estimation.
Okay. This leads us to another practical problem the sources explored, determining the single bolt permeability for a burrowed rock zone to use in reservoir models.
Right.
You can measure permeability in tiny plugs of the matrix or the fill. We know those numbers can be vastly different. But how do you get one number representing flow through the whole complex volume?
It's really tricky because you have this dual permeability system. Just taking a simple average of spot measurements doesn't work. Different mathematical averages, you have arithmetic, harmonic, geometric means, they give wildly different results.
How different?
Well, the sources showed an example where these different averages for a single sample range from 0.7 mD for the harmonic mean to 1.8 mD for the geometric mean, all the way up to 20.7 mD for the arithmetic mean.
Huge range.
Massive range. You absolutely need to know which one is appropriate for your situation.
And previous studies on other rock types had suggested certain averaging methods might work best depending on the permeability contrast between matrix and fill and the overall bioturbation intensity, right?
That's right. Based on those prior ideas, and given that the Hanifa samples fit a dual permeability case with what might be considered low to moderate bioturbation intensity overall, the geometric mean, that 1.8 milli value in the example, would have been predicted as the best estimate for the bulk permeability.
That wasn't what the actual experiments showed.
Exactly. This is another key finding from these Hanifa studies. They conducted core-scale water flooding experiments, which actually measure the flow through a larger core plug that includes both matrix and burrows.
Okay, so real flow measurement.
Real flow measurement. Yeah. And the measured bulk permeability from these experiments averaged 17.3 millids across similar samples.
Which is much, much closer to the arithmetic mean, 20.7 millid, than the geometric mean, 1.8 millid.
Precisely. This finding is really significant. It suggests that once the burrow network establishes connectivity, once you hit that 15% BP threshold, we talked about the fluid flow through the bulk rock volume, behaves more like flow through continuous interconnected pathways running in parallel.
Cool.
And the arithmetic mean is the correct averaging method for flow through parallel pathways.
So even if the overall BP isn't considered high by some older classifications, the connectivity achieved around 15% BP is the dominant factor controlling bulk flow, making the arithmetic mean the appropriate average in this case.
That seems to be the conclusion from these studies, yes. Connectivity fundamentally changes the flow regime, and it appears to override some previous assumptions about averaging methods based solely on intensity classifications. It's the plumbing network being properly hooked up that matters most for bulk flow.
Okay, bringing this all together then, what's the big practical takeaway from these Hanifa formation studies and the sources we've looked at today?
I think the core message is that even carbonate rock strata that appear inherently tight, of a mud-dominated matrix that looks like it shouldn't flow at all, can actually contain significant, potentially commercially relevant permeability and serve as effective fluid flow zones. And this isn't due to the original rock itself, but specifically because of the interconnected network of coarse-grained material filling ancient burrow systems like thalassinoids.
So these could represent valuable, potentially overlooked subsurface reservoirs for oil, gas, or water.
Absolutely. They could function as important hydrocarbon reservoirs or significant groundwater aquifers, similar to other ichnofossil-hosted tight reservoirs that have been documented elsewhere. The challenge really is identifying them effectively.
And they might be missed by conventional techniques? Is that the risk?
They very well could be, yes.
Yeah.
Standard subsurface evaluation often relies on tools or methods that might not resolve these fine-scale networks or capture their full 3D impact. As we discussed, standard core descriptions based on single 2D slices can underestimate the true BP and connectivity. That's why integrated studies, the kind that combine detailed technology, the study of trace fossils,
Mhm.
petrophysics, advanced imaging like CT scanning, rock physics modeling, and actual flow experiments, are so vital for correctly identifying and characterizing these potentially valuable zones.
So understanding the specific burrow type, the quality of its fill material, that critical BP threshold for connectivity, and how all that translates into properties like seismic velocity and bulk permeability, that's really key to finding these hidden pathways in other basins around the world.
It really is. It's about recognizing that ancient life didn't just leave behind interesting shapes in the rock. It fundamentally engineered the rock's physical properties in ways that matter profoundly millions of years later.
It's quite remarkable to think about that, isn't it? The activity of small organisms from the distant Jurassic period could so profoundly impact the potential of rocks for human use today. These studies show scientists using really sophisticated modern tools to unlock secrets left by tiny creatures in the deep past.
It's a great example of how layering different scientific disciplines, paleontology, sedimentology, petrophysics, geophysics, is absolutely essential for truly understanding these complex subsurface systems. You can't just look at one piece.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener. Consider the vast volumes of subsurface rock on Earth. How much untapped potential, whether for energy, for water, or even perhaps for things like carbon storage, how much might still be hidden in plain sight, just waiting to be discovered simply by applying this deeper, more integrated understanding of the subtle yet powerful impact of ancient life.